In the fall of 1714, 42 coastal Carolinas mysteriously disappeared without a trace. They weren't taken hostage, they weren't sold into slavery, they weren't attacked in raids, they just vanished. But what makes the disappearance all the more terrifying is the account of every eyewitness. The pirate captain behind the disappearance didn't care about gold or silver. He didn't even look at the ships. He picked them apart one by one, like a farmer picking out cattle at market, examining their teeth, listening for their breathing, testing their reflexes, all with the cold, precise precision of a doctor making his rounds. Colonial records buried for centuries in the Charleston archives and only recently accessible to researchers reveal that Captain Ezekiel Thorne was no ordinary pirate. Court documents from his time in the British Navy describe him as a brilliant physician who saved the lives of hundreds of soldiers during his Caribbean campaigns. Medical journals at the Portsmouth Naval Hospital praised his pioneering techniques and his almost supernatural ability to keep people alive through life-ending surgeries. But in the disease-ridden waters of Spanish Main, the lifesaver became something else entirely. For more than 300 years, the fate of those 42 souls has become one of America's most haunting maritime mysteries. Colonial authorities classified the investigation. Families were told their loved ones had perished in the shipwreck, but the truth was buried under layers of misinformation and deliberate silence. Now, archaeological discoveries in Cuban waters, deciphered documents from Spanish monasteries, and recently declassified British naval records have revealed the gruesome truth about these innocent people's fate. Before we dive into the story of Captain Thorne and his horrifying experiments, it's worth remembering that this channel is dedicated to telling the darkest and most grisly stories in American history. Stories that history books often ignore or deliberately suppress. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and let me know which state you're watching from in the comments. I love knowing where you're watching from, and it helps me understand which regional stories resonate most with our community. Now let's explore the true fate of those 42 innocent people and why their disappearance became one of the most chilling chapters in early American maritime history. The records that will be told have been confirmed through colonial archives, ship logs, testimony from 3 different countries, and physical evidence that has survived for centuries. They paint a picture so haunting that it challenges our previous understanding of piracy medicine and the cost of scientific progress in the 18th century. Coastal Carolina in 1714 was a land between 2 worlds where European civilization collided with the untamed wilderness in a constant struggle for survival. Just 4 years after becoming a royal colony, the region stretched for hundreds of miles along a treacherous coastline, dotted with fragile settlements, the most precarious footholds of human existence in the New World. These communities struggled to survive under the constant threat of Spanish pirates in Florida, hostile Creek and Cherokee armies from the interior, and the ever-present threat of pirates using the countless inlets and barrier islands as bases. Charlestown, today's Charleston, was the colonial capital and the only truly fortified settlement home to about 3,000 people. Merchants, craftsmen, officials, and their families. Outside those walls were dozens of small communities along the river and inlets. Rice plantations built on malaria-infested swamps. Logging camps where men felled ancient pines and cypresses to supply British shipbuilding. fishing villages where families made a living from the sea, trading posts that traded with local tribes for deerskins and other wild goods. This was a harsh land that bred a hardy people who crossed the sea to escape poverty, religious persecution, or legal trouble in Europe. Families like Pettenston Thomas, a shipwright from Devon, who had been apprenticed at the Royal Naval Dockyard, and his wife Margaret had 3 children, though they lost 2 others to the fevers that claimed the lives of colonial infants Dot. They established a sawmill near Ashley River, using Thomas's naval experience to craft special timbers for shipbuilding. And then there was Rebecca Hartwell, a widow in her 30s who ran a small shop and taught local children to read. She had come to Carolina as the bride of a tobacco planter, only to lose her husband to the yellow fever epidemic that swept through the colony in 1711. Rather than return to England in disgrace, she used her husband's modest fortune to establish herself as one of the few literate women in the region, teaching the children of artisans and planters to read and calculate. These were not the wealthy rice planters with hundreds of slaves and vast estates that would define Carolina's golden age. These were working-class families, people who owned a few acres of reclaimed land, a few tools, and the quiet hope that their labor would bring safety to their children. They lived in wooden houses with oil paper windows, wore clothes they wove themselves, and considered themselves lucky if they could eat meat more than twice a week. The political climate added to the tensions of everyday life. Queen Anne's War had just ended with the Treaty of Utrecht, but the peace was as fragile as anyone could tell. The conflict left thousands of sailors and soldiers unemployed along the American coast. Men who had spent their lives learning to fight and kill were now left aimless, many turning to piracy as their only way of surviving in a world that had discarded them like broken tools. The colonial government, stretched thin between London's demands and local interests, could barely maintain order in Charlestown, let alone patrol the dozens of hidden estuaries and bays that were ideal places for pirates to hide. Governor Charles Craven, appointed just 2 years earlier, commanded fewer than 50 regular troops and relied on poorly trained and poorly equipped militia units. His naval force consisted of only 1 armed sloop and a few merchant ships, which were mobilized temporarily when needed. Into this unstable environment emerged Captain Ezekiel Thorne, a man whose presence transformed piracy from opportunistic crime to something more terrifying. Born in London around 1675 to a humble merchant family, Thorne was educated at a prestigious grammar school before being appointed assistant surgeon in the Royal Navy. This was no small achievement for the son of a merchant. Naval positions were usually reserved for the sons of nobles or those with powerful connections. Naval records from Portsmouth record Thorne serving with distinction aboard HMS Defiance during campaigns against the French and Spanish in the Caribbean. Records held in the British National Archives show that he rose from assistant surgeon to chief surgeon in just 4 years, a process that would normally take a decade. Commanding officers praised his surgical skills, his calmness in battle, and his innovative approach to treating the wounded in cramped, unsanitary conditions on board a warship. But those same records hint at the darkness that would later consume him. Fellow officers wrote in private correspondence discovered in British archives in the 1980s that Thorne had a strange obsession with the mechanics of injury and death. He would take on the most horrific cases, spending hours studying wounds that other doctors would quickly patch up and forget. During a fierce battle with Spanish pirates, Thorne was observed meticulously sketching the dying, recording their last words and the progress of their injuries with a scientific detachment that made his colleagues shudder. Young Thorne possessed the skill which would have made him the best naval surgeon of his generation. Commander William Hayes wrote to his brother in 1710, "But there was something in his eyes as he worked that made my blood run cold. He studied pain and death as others study maps, as if pain and death were lands to be explored and conquered." The disappearances began on October 15, 1714, when Willowbrook Plantation, a rice plantation, located on a bend in the Cooper River about 20 miles north of Charlestown, was attacked. The plantation was owned by Samuel Hawthorne, the second son of a minor English aristocrat who had invested his modest inheritance in Carolina rice farming. Hawthorne employed 12 indentured laborers, mostly Scots, who had sold themselves to pay for passage to America, and owned 15 African slaves purchased from a slave ship the previous year. The physical layout of the plantation reflected the typical pattern of Carolina rice plantations. The main house was built on a raised platform to avoid flooding, surrounded by outbuildings that included indentured laborers' quarters, slave sheds, a grain mill, and workshops to maintain the system of dikes and canals that carried water throughout the rice fields. The entire compound was connected by raised walkways and rudimentary dirt roads, which were often flooded during the rainy season. According to the detailed testimony of the plantation manager, Jonathan Cray, who survived by hiding in a granary during the attack, the pirates appeared with the morning mist that often rolled in from the river during the autumn months. But this was not a raid that anyone who survived remembered. No cannon fire announced their arrival, no shouts over the water, no flames bursting from the charred buildings. They came as silently as death itself. Cray later told colonial investigators, his old cracked hands shaking as he recalled, "I was inspecting the morning harvest when I heard whispering near the main house. By the time I realized what was happening, they had surrounded the entire building." Cray describes Captain Thorne dressed in a navy blue coat with brass buttons, but bearing no rank, moving methodically through the structures with a small group of armed men. But these were not the foul, dirty pirates of his imagination. They acted with military discipline, spoke softly, and followed a well-prepared plan. Most horrifyingly, Thorne carried a leather notebook and spent several minutes studying each person he met, taking careful notes. The selection process shattered all expectations of pirate behavior. Older people were immediately released and told to stay in the compound. Children under 16 were also interviewed briefly and released. Anyone showing signs of illness, injury, or weakness was eliminated. But healthy adults between the ages of 20 and 40 were subjected to a thorough examination that was more like a medical examination than a military arrest. Thorne pressed his ear to their chests, listening to their heartbeats like a doctor checking their health. Cray recounted. He examined their teeth, tested their reflexes by tapping their knees and elbows, and made them walk straight to observe their gait. When Miss Mary Caldwell cried, who was only 18 and had never traveled more than 10 miles, he said tears indicated good nerves and added them to his book. The 8 chosen from Willowbrook included Samuel Hawthorne, his nephew Peter, the plantation bookkeeper, 2 skilled craftsmen indentured to work as carpenters, 3 young slaves, and Mary Caldwell, an indentured laborer from Ireland who had arrived 6 months earlier. They were bound with ropes but not abused, and Thorne's men provided water and blankets for the long journey. Before leaving, Thorne addressed the remaining men in words that Cray would remember for the rest of his life. These men will contribute to a work that will benefit all mankind. Their service will advance human knowledge in ways you cannot comprehend. Do not try to follow or interfere, and nothing more will happen to your community. The robbers withdrew as quietly as they had come, loading the hostages onto the riverboat. The entire operation took less than 2 hours and was carried out with an efficiency that belied careful preparation and reconnaissance. But what was most frightening was Thorne's demeanor throughout the attack, calm, professional, and completely detached from the terror he had unleashed. 3 days later, the same pattern of terror was repeated at Cedar Point, a fishing village nestled around a natural harbor, where 24 families depended on the sea for their livelihood. The next raid followed the same deliberate method, arriving quietly, systematically inspecting the population, carefully selecting able-bodied adults. 6 people from coastal communities were taken, including James Fairfax, a blacksmith whose skills seemed to have particularly caught Thorne's eye, and Sarah Pemberton, a young mother who had left her infant child with a neighbor when she was selected. Elias Dunham, a fisherman who survived by hiding under a capsized boat on the beach, provided the most detailed account of Thorne's selection criteria. According to Dunham's account to colonial authorities, he asked each man about his health, family history, and occupation. Thorne seemed to take special interest in those who had never had a fever, smallpox, or serious illness. When he learned that James Fairfax, a young blacksmith, had never been seriously ill, he smiled a smile that chilled my spine. It was the smile of a man who had found what he wanted. The psychological impact on the surviving communities was terrible. Unlike ordinary pirate attacks which created understandable fear, Thorne's attacks instilled a terror bordering on insanity. Parents began hiding healthy children, encouraging minor injuries or illnesses so that they would not be selected. Communities that had survived Indian attacks, Spanish raids, and frontier threats were suddenly helpless against an enemy whose motives they could not understand. Over the next 6 weeks, Thorne's systematic campaign continued along the Carolina coast. Pine Harbor, a logging camp where old trees were cut down for shipment to England, lost 5 men. Marsh Landing, a small port where coastal traders traded, saw 7 residents disappear. Cooper's Ford, a river crossing where travelers stopped before heading to Charlestown, was attacked twice, losing a total of 9 men who met Thorne's mysterious criteria. Each attack followed the same pattern: come quietly, check the method, choose carefully, leave without taking any items or property. Families offered large ransoms to save their loved ones, but no demands were made. The raiders seemed uninterested in gold, silver goods, or any of the traditional motives that motivated crime. The most horrifying account comes from the last recorded attack on the 28th of November, 1714, at Haven's Rest, a small port where coastal ships took in fresh water and supplies. Martha Pickering, the wife of a local innkeeper, was initially chosen by Thorne, but was released when he discovered she was pregnant with her 3rd child. She recounted, "He examined me as a trained physician. He pressed on my belly, asking me details of my previous pregnancies and the health of my children. When he found out I was with child, He said I was unfit for duty and released me at once. But before he let her go, Thorne said something that would haunt Martha Pickering for the rest of her life. The 42 souls I have gathered will help to discover the secrets of life. Their sacrifice will serve humanity, even if they do not live to see the results. When asked about Thorne's appearance and demeanor during the searches, she described him as a man of about 40, with graying hair and an intelligent gaze that seemed to register every observation. He spoke like a scholar, using words she did not understand, including Latin phrases and medical terms beyond her. But there was something broken in his voice, as if he had witnessed things no Christian should have seen. He moved with a heavy burden, and he believed that the burden was justified by a noble cause. The immediate aftermath of the disappearances threw the Carolina colony into unprecedented chaos. Governor Charles Kraravin, under pressure from a panicked populace, angry families, and increasingly impatient London officials, organized the largest sea search in the colony's short history. 3 naval vessels were mobilized: HMS Squirrel, a 6th-rate frigate that was the colony's main guard; HMS Garland, a small coastal patrol sloop; and Carolina Merchant, a merchant ship hastily armed with cannons borrowed from Charlestown Fort. These were supplemented by any armed merchantmen, fishing boats, and coastal merchant ships that could be persuaded or coerced into joining the search. The colonial government also offered large rewards for information, leading to the recovery of the missing men, attracting privateers, ex-pirates seeking amnesty, and adventurers hoping to profit from the crisis. The search revealed disturbing clues scattered along the southeast coast. On Kiowa Island, just south of Charlestown, search parties discovered the remains of a makeshift camp that had housed a large group for weeks. The site contained traces of systematically arranged cooking stoves, carefully organized toilets, and most disturbingly, crude surgical facilities constructed from driftwood and shipwreck timber. Lieutenant William Harrington of the Colonial Guards, who led the investigation at Kiowa, reported that the findings raised more questions than they answered. He wrote, "We found instruments which our ship's doctor identified as medical instruments, but many of a design never before seen in the training of the Royal College of Surgeons. There were strangely curved bone saws, medical forceps of various sizes arranged in an orderly fashion, and glass vials containing strange substances which our doctor could not identify. More disturbingly, traces of human habitation suggest that the area was organized according to a predetermined plan. The sleeping quarters were arranged in rows, with each individual having his own space marked by small stakes driven into the ground. A large central fire pit was surrounded by wooden benches arranged in concentric circles as if for group meetings or instruction. And most horrifyingly, a series of wooden tables stained with substances that testing later determined to be human blood. The arrangement suggested medical procedures rather than the chaotic violence of pirates. Harrington wrote in his report to Governor Kraravin, "This level of organization and planning suggests resources and knowledge far beyond what would be expected of ordinary pirates. These were not the actions of desperate men seeking a quick profit, but of individuals pursuing a systematic goal." Similar sites were discovered on Johns Island, Folly Island, and several other small barrier islands between Charlestown and Savannah. Each showed signs of careful preparation, temporary occupation by large groups, and functioned more like field medical stations than pirate camps. The consistency of the evidence suggests that Thorne's organization knew the coastal geography well and had prepared several staging posts for its operations. But the most important discovery occurred on December 20th, 1714, when a group of fishermen working near the mouth of the Santee River saw smoke rising from Gull's Rest Island, a piece of wasteland that local sailors avoided due to dangerous currents and reefs. When colonial forces arrived 3 days later, they found an abandoned camp, but with clear signs of the recent presence of a very large group. Captain Henry Morrison of the Colonial Guards, who led the investigation team, produced the most detailed report of any area inspected during the operation. Gull's Rest had been converted into a makeshift medical facility operating under field conditions. The main camp was divided into clearly defined functional areas. Sleeping quarters for about 60 men were arranged in military-style rows, each individual space marked with hastily left personal effects. The center of the camp had a large fire pit surrounded by wooden benches and a platform constructed from driftwood and shipwreck timbers. Morrison noted that this arrangement suggested regular group meetings, perhaps for instruction or planning. But the most disturbing area was a series of wooden tables and chairs under a canvas roof protected from the sun and rain. These tables bore clear traces of surgical procedures. Morrison writes, "Our ship's Dr. Alexander Whiteside examined the scene and identified bone cuts, butchering, and what appeared to be systematic anatomical studies. The arrangement of instruments, the drainage grooves carved into the wood surfaces, and the orderly organization of the work area suggested medical procedures performed by individuals with formal training. Perhaps most chilling were the detailed notes and drawings found buried under one of the wooden structures, written mostly in Latin, with sections using secret medical codes proving that this was no game or random violence, but a cold, scientific, and horrifying plan. These documents contained anatomical drawings and observational notes demonstrating a level of medical knowledge that was both advanced and terrifying. Dr. Alexander Whiteside, who had trained at the University of Edinburgh and was the only physician in the colony who could read medical Latin, was called upon to study and translate the documents. His translations revealed observations on human anatomy and physiology that far exceeded any accepted medical knowledge in Europe for decades. The notes detailed the pathways of the blood, the nervous system's response to various stimuli, and surgical procedures that were not formally developed until the mid-18th century. But most horrifying of all, the documents also referred to experimental subjects, controlled observations of physiological responses to stress-pain threshold testing, suggesting that these advances were achieved through systematic human experimentation. Dr. Whiteside noted in a secret report to Governor Craven, "The anatomical drawings show a knowledge of internal organ function that is on a par with the best European physicians. But the methods by which this knowledge was acquired completely disregarded Christian ethics and medical morality. Whoever wrote these documents possessed the skill of a master physician, but abandoned all concern for human life in the pursuit of knowledge. Faced with evidence of systematic atrocities, but with no survivors to pursue, the colonial authorities made a decision that kept the truth about Thorne's experiments hidden for centuries. Official records were classified as a sensitive colonial security matter. Families of the missing were told only that their loved ones had probably died in a shipwreck while attempting to flee, and all physical evidence was destroyed or transferred to safekeeping in London. The decision was justified in order to prevent panic among the population and to avoid disclosing information that might encourage similar criminal activity. Nevertheless, rumors and whispers persisted in coastal communities. Fishermen reported seeing strange lights on the islands in the months following the disappearance. Not ordinary campfires, but systematic patterns of light, suggesting organized nighttime activities. Some captains claimed to have discovered abandoned camps on remote beaches, always with signs of new fires and tools in use, but never with any sign of human habitation. A pattern began to emerge. It seemed that someone was continuing Thorne's work in secret, moving from place to place to avoid detection. The consequences were horrifying. Thorne's organization may have survived the colonization campaign, or the knowledge they gained is being carried on by others with the same ruthlessness and disregard for human life. The mystery took on an international dimension in the spring of 1715 when a Spanish merchant ship, the Santa Catalina, limped into Charlestown harbor with damage that its captain described as the most unusual pirate encounter in his 30 years at sea. Captain Diego Velázquez, a veteran of the Caribbean trade, told colonial authorities through Father Rodriguez, a Spanish priest and interpreter. They stopped us 3 miles south of the Florida coast. But they did not fire, did not order us to surrender, did not board the ship by force. Instead, their commander asked permission to board under a white flag, saying that he only wanted to examine our crew for disease and, if necessary, to treat it. 2. Velázquez's description of the captain matched exactly what survivors of Thorne's attacks on the Carolinas had to say. A man in his 40s, well-educated, dressed in naval style, but without official insignia, carrying a leather diary, and more obsessively interested in medical examination than traditional plunder. But the most horrifying part was what happened next. When some of the sailors began showing symptoms of yellow fever, a terrible disease that could kill an entire crew in a matter of days, Velázquez said he had no choice. Thorne and several assistants formerly captives who now worked under him voluntarily began examining the sick sailors, taking meticulous notes, drawing anatomical illustrations of their symptoms with the precision of professional medical artists. The English captain's knowledge of disease was extraordinary, Velázquez reported. He accurately diagnosed conditions that baffled even the most experienced ship's doctors, prescribed remedies I had never seen before, and performed surgical procedures that were almost miraculous in their effectiveness. Within days, men who had previously seemed near death recovered completely. But the most shocking thing was not Thorne's medical ability, but the behavior of his assistants. One of them, a young man, with the bearing and speech of a gentleman, quietly introduced himself to Velázquez as Thomas Petton, the son of a Carolina shipwright captured in the October raids. Speaking quietly in the Spanish he had learned during his captivity, Petton conveyed a message that turned all assumptions about Thorne's victims upside down. "We were taken against our will at first," Petton told Velázquez, "but we came to understand the importance of Captain Thorne's work. We were taking part in a great medical project that would save thousands of lives in the future." This revelation suggested that at least some of Thorne's victims were not killed, but became willing collaborators in his experiments. The psychological implications were astonishing. what procedures, persuasion, or pressure had turned the kidnapped into loyal assistants, even admiring their captor. Velasquez continued that before leaving the British, Captain had left the Santa Catalina with a supply of medicine that could prevent outbreaks of fever among the crew. These treatments were more effective than anything Velasquez had ever encountered in his 3 decades at sea in the Caribbean. But the price of this miracle was seeing honest men reduced to the servants of what he could only describe as madness. The Spanish captain's testimony was corroborated by other sailors on board, providing further details about Thorne's organization, painting a picture of a sophisticated operation far removed from the typical pirate image. Thorne's ship, as Velasquez described it, was a converted galleon flying the British flag, but the interior had been converted into medical facilities. Through open windows, the Spanish sailors saw interior spaces that looked more like infirmaries than pirate quarters, with rows of beds, surgical instruments, and even a medical library. Colonial investigators led by Judge Samuel Richardson began to piece together a timeline that suggested Thorne had not simply disappeared after the November attacks, but had established a mobile sea base that expanded operations throughout the Caribbean. This theory was reinforced by reports from 1715 from multiple sources along the southeast coast and Caribbean ports. An English captain reported encountering a ship matching Thorne's description near Nassau, where the captain requested permission to examine sailors suffering from dysentery. A French privateer reported being approached by English-speaking pirates who offered to share their advanced medical knowledge in exchange for information on Spanish expeditions. Most importantly, several former prisoners of various pirate crews reported meeting men who claimed to be former Carolina residents. These men, according to Jamaican colonial records, spoke of engaging in medical research that would revolutionize our understanding of disease injury and basic human life processes. The model that emerged was a floating medical laboratory protected by armed vessels, its crew made up of both volunteers and forced assistants. But key questions remained unanswered. What about the victims who refused to cooperate? How did Thorne maintain the discipline and loyalty of those taken from their homes? And what medical discoveries could justify such horrific methods? The answers gradually emerged from an unexpected source. The private correspondence of Dr. James Peyton, a Scottish physician working in Jamaica, who began seeing former patients from Thorne's facilities. Letters to his colleague Dr. William Loud at the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh, discovered during library renovations in 1923, provides the most detailed account of Thorne's medical experiments and their effects on humans. Dr. Peyton's correspondence, spanning December 1715 to March 1716, records systematic meetings with individuals who had escaped from what he described as a floating hospital run by British pirates in the Caribbean. These letters, written in the formal medical language of the period but filled with horror, provide important insight into the scale and nature of Thorne's experiments. This week, I have treated 3 persons who claim to have been the subjects of medical experiments on board pirate ships. Peyton wrote in the first letter, dated December 15th, 1715. Their stories are almost too horrible to believe, but their physical condition is incontrovertible evidence of operations far superior to anything practiced in civilized medicine. The scars on the bodies of the escapees demonstrate that the operations would have killed them under normal conditions, but they not only survived, but also possessed remarkable physical abilities. Peton notes in detail that the escapees described a systematic program of human experimentation on a galleon converted to serve as a floating laboratory. The ship, which they called the Anatomist, was equipped with surgical facilities comparable to the best hospitals in London or Edinburgh, with ample lighting, ventilation, and storage facilities that suggested a large financial investment and meticulous planning. The medical facilities on board spanned several floors, with separate areas for each type of procedure, operating rooms for major operations, recovery areas with dozens of beds in rows, isolation rooms for patients with infectious diseases, and even primitive laboratories for preparing and testing medicines. The level of organization and equipment far exceeded the capabilities of any conventional pirate operation. But the most shocking revelations concern the methods used to maintain the compliance and cooperation of his coerced victims. Thorne did not simply use violence or the threat of death, but developed a sophisticated system of psychological conditioning, combined with genuine medical interests, creating a complex relationship between captor and victim. One man Peton examined, who had been born with a paralyzed arm and unable to do heavy labor, had regained full function through reconstructive surgery of bone muscle and nerve tissue, using techniques never before seen in medical literature. When asked about the procedure, he was both horrified and grateful to Captain Thorne, an image that sent shivers down Peton's spine. The escapees described a meticulously orchestrated medical transformation, beginning with a thorough physical examination to identify diseases, injuries, or deformities that could be surgically corrected. Victims who cooperated with the initial evaluations were treated for conditions that had plagued them for years. Chronic pain was alleviated, old injuries were treated with techniques decades ahead of medical science, and illnesses were treated with near-miracle drugs. Peton wrote, "The surgical precision required for these operations far exceeded anything I had seen during my training. But these procedures were performed under field conditions at sea. Those who refused to participate in the study or attempted to escape suffered horrific consequences as a living example of deterrence." Peton noted that one young woman who attempted to escape the ship during the first month had her larynx surgically destroyed, leaving her only able to whisper. The precision of the injury demonstrated sophisticated anatomical knowledge and the deliberate intention to create a disability without endangering her life. She became a living warning to those who dared to resist. In addition, Peton's correspondence reveals that Thorne's operations had expanded far beyond the original 42 Carolina residents. By 1715, the floating laboratory reportedly contained more than 100 subjects of various nationalities, all carefully selected for physical and mental characteristics for various research purposes. The Spanish provided subjects for research into tropical disease resistance. The French were involved in research into surgical techniques for treating combat injuries. Africans purchased from slave traders were used for physical endurance and pain threshold experiments. Each group served its own research purposes, creating a systematic program of human experimentation that rivaled the scale of any medical institution in Europe. Daily life on board was also meticulously organized. Subjects were grouped based on health status and research tasks. Those undergoing medical treatment received the best care and nutrition for optimal recovery. Participants testing new procedures were kept in a strictly controlled environment to maximize scientific value while minimizing the risk of losing research resources. If you're already shivering at this point, share this video with your friends who love dark mysteries. Hit like to support the content, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future historical horror stories. Peyton writes that in early 1716, he was approached by representatives of the Thorn organization with an invitation to join the research efforts. The invitation was delivered to Peyton by a well-dressed gentleman who appeared at his Kingston clinic in February 1716, promising access to medical knowledge that would revolutionize surgery, the treatment of disease, and the understanding of human anatomy and physiology. I am faced with an opportunity to challenge every principle of medicine that I have sworn to defend, Peyton confessed to his colleagues in Edinburgh. These men promised to share discoveries that would save thousands of lives, cures for diseases that now claimed countless lives, surgical techniques to restore function to the disabled and hope to the hopeless. But these methods completely abandoned Christian ethics and the basic principles of medicine. The invitation also included detailed descriptions of research projects that both amazed and horrified Peyton Thorn's organization, claimed to have developed organ transplants methods to repair spinal cord injuries that enabled paralyzed people to walk, and treatments for mental illnesses that were considered incurable. They spoke of advances in the understanding of blood circulation, reconstructive brain surgeries, and drugs that extended life beyond natural limits. I am torn between my Hippocratic oath and scientific curiosity, he wrote in his final letter. The advances they were making could alleviate endless suffering and transform medicine from a crude art into a true science. But the trade-off was the systematic sacrifice of unwilling human subjects, turning them into experimental subjects. Peyton feared that accepting would endanger his own soul, but refusing would deprive humanity of discoveries that would save countless lives. The decisive moment came when Peyton was presented with physical evidence of Thorn's achievement. Detailed anatomical drawings revealing internal structures with a precision that legitimate medicine had to wait for advanced surgical techniques to achieve. Revolutionary medical instruments performing operations that conventional instruments could not. And most importantly, former patients who testified to the successful results of the experiments. They brought a man who had been born blind, but who could now see completely after reconstructive surgery. I have examined his eye thoroughly, Peyton wrote in his final letter dated March 10, 1716, and have found traces of surgery replacing the damaged structure with healthy tissue from another source. The accuracy of the operation is beyond our medical knowledge, but the evidence is incontrovertible. Peyton's letter ends abruptly after that, and no further correspondence has been found in any archive. Jamaican colonial records show that he disappeared from Kingston without explanation, leaving behind his practiced personal possessions and a substantial sum of money in the bank. His medical equipment and library were intact, indicating a sudden and unplanned departure. This revealed that Thorn's organization was actively recruiting qualified physicians, expanding its research capabilities, promising knowledge that legitimate institutions would have to wait decades or centuries to achieve. The recruitment strategy targeted ambitious physicians lured by the promise of unprecedented medical discoveries, regardless of the moral costs. But the most shocking revelation came from an encrypted message found in the spine of a Peyton medical book that had been bound during an estate sale in 1876. The code was deciphered in the 1940s, revealing that Thorne's experiments had achieved a breakthrough that shocked even his willing collaborators. The message reads that he has learned to prolong life beyond natural limits. But the cost in human suffering is unimaginable. Subjects who undergo the final procedures emerge with changes that challenge our understanding of human nature. I fear we have created something that should never have existed. The knowledge gained may be too dangerous for mankind. If I do not return from this voyage, know that some discoveries are too terrible to pursue, some prices too high to pay, even for the advancement of science. The final chapter of Thorne's fate is revealed in a surprising way in the deathbed declaration of Father Miguel Santos at the monastery of San Cristobal, Cuba, in the winter of 1718. The dead man, known to the monks only as El Quiruano Inglés, had arrived at the monastery 3 years earlier in a state of complete physical and mental collapse, stuttering in English and Latin, apparently suffering from severe psychological trauma. Father Santos, who studied at the University of Salamanca before his ordination, cared for this mysterious patient. His carefully kept records, discovered in 1894, describe 3 years of gradual recovery, during which the patient was barely able to speak, speaking only in fragments about surgeries, test subjects transformed beyond recognition, and a captain whose thirst for medical knowledge led to discoveries that should never have been made. The patient's physical condition provided frightening evidence of self-experimentation. His body bore the scars of numerous surgeries, some successful, others resembling failed attempts at the border between medicine and self-destruction. His hands, though steady enough to perform delicate operations, showed signs of deliberate alteration. More sensitive fingertips for surgical precision, an unusually flexible and strong hand structure. And this man was clearly both a doctor and an experimental subject, Father Santos wrote in his private diary. His body bore evidence of procedures that both enhanced his physical abilities and demonstrated the price paid for experiments that pushed the limits of man to the limit. As death approached the patient's mind, lucid enough to provide a coherent account, that Father Santos found too detailed and consistent to be considered insane. The confession, written in Latin to preserve secrecy and protect the abbey from accusations, reveals the final chapter in the Thorne mystery and the fate of the 42 Carolina residents. The man, it is claimed, was Dr. James Peaton, the Scottish physician who joined Thorne's organization in 1716. He describes a floating laboratory that became a chamber of horrors where the desire for medical knowledge turned into systematic torture disguised as scientific research. The initial Carolina residents became the basis for an ever-expanding program of human experimentation with more than 200 subjects by 1717. Thorne had achieved his goal of unlocking the mysteries of human physiology, but each step required increasingly gruesome methods. He learned how to keep subjects alive through procedures that would otherwise kill them, repair and enhance organs with tissue from other subjects, and extend life beyond natural limits through methods that cost the lives of others. The floating laboratory was organized into several research areas. The Human Endurance Research Area, which exposed subjects to starvation, extreme temperatures, and physical stress while monitoring their reactions. The Surgical Development Area, which used unwilling subjects to test new procedures and devices without regard to survival. The enhancement research area, which attempted to improve physical and mental abilities through surgery and chemicals, strength speed senses, and brain function, were altered. We created deformities, Peyton confessed to Father Santos. Men who are stronger than normal, but whose minds are broken. Women whose senses are so acute that they cannot bear normal light or sound. Children who grow abnormally fast, their bodies developed, but their minds stuck in childhood. Thorne himself became the worst test subject, transforming from a brilliant but normal doctor into an entity that transcended human limits. He enhanced his physical abilities, extended his lifespan, and altered his senses and mind to the point that Peyton called superhuman, but fundamentally flawed. Thorne no longer saw his subjects as human beings, but as collections of organs, tissues, and systems to be studied, modified, and used for research purposes. The most horrifying discovery was Thorne's final experiment, transferring all of his accumulated knowledge and longevity into a new body when his own began to fail. Peyton describes, "We prepared for months developing procedures to transfer not only organs and tissues, but also memories, knowledge, and the essence of consciousness from one body to another." The captain became obsessed with immortality, believing his medical knowledge was too valuable to die a natural death. The experiment, performed on a quiet night on the hidden island, failed miserably. Thorne and his replacement both died, but before they died, the two bodies partially merged, creating a being that was neither quite alive nor quite dead, possessing characteristics of both, but belonging to neither. "We found them in the operating room the next morning," the confessor recounted. The two bodies shared physical characteristics, unable to live independently, but still conscious and aware. Thorne's memories and knowledge were partially transferred, but the result was madness rather than immortality. The last surviving associates eventually rebelled against Thorne, destroying the floating laboratory. The remaining crew, including the original Carolina residents who became his partners, realized that Thorne's path did not lead to salvation, but to the dehumanization of humanity. "We cannot allow that knowledge to exist or spread," Peyton confirmed. The captain's final experiment showed the horrifying consequences of ambition exceeding natural and moral limits, ending the darkest chapter in the history of medicine and piracy that anyone had ever imagined. The destruction of the floating laboratory was carried out with the same systematicity and precision that Thorne had applied to his medical research. Test subjects who could not survive outside the ship's controlled environment were mercifully released from their suffering. Those who had been enhanced or altered too far to live normally were given poisons that ended their suffering quickly and peacefully. All research papers, diaries, medical instruments, preserved specimens, and detailed records of hundreds of experiments were systematically destroyed. Books were burned, instruments were thrown overboard, and 3 years of careful research was sunk to the bottom of the Caribbean. It took us 3 days to make sure that every trace of the captain's work was wiped out, Peyton reported. Even those who had benefited from Thorne's techniques found the knowledge too dangerous to retain. Some discoveries, they realized, were too horrific for humanity to possess. The last of the floating ships sank in the deep waters off Cuba, taking with it all the physical evidence of Thorne's experiments. The survivors were scattered, many driven mad by what they had seen, others determined to ensure that Thorne's discovery died with them. Some, like Peyton, turned to religious organizations hoping to find forgiveness for their role in the horrors. The confession ends with Piton's final warning about the dangers of pursuing knowledge without moral boundaries. We thought we were expanding human knowledge, pushing the boundaries of medicine for the benefit of humanity. But we realized too late that there were boundaries that existed for good reason, that people should not know and do everything no matter how great the benefit. Father Santos recorded that Peyton died peacefully in his sleep on December 25th, 1718, with a final prayer for the souls who had suffered because of Thorne's research. The monastery buried him in an unmarked grave, respecting his final wish for secrecy. The final piece of this centuries-old puzzle came in 1923, when the San Cristobal Monastery was being renovated. Workers discovered a hidden room containing documents that Father Santos had sealed before his death in 1742. These included not only Peyton's full confession but also testimonies from other survivors who had visited the monastery over the years. These documents, analyzed by Dr. Edmund Hartwell Smithsonian, 1924, revealed that the truth about Thorne's experiments was maintained by Catholic priests for moral reasons, even though kept secret from secular authorities. The archives contain testimony from 7 survivors who visited the monastery between 1718 and 1738, confirming key elements of Peyton's confession, while also adding details about various aspects of Thorne's activities. A testimony from ship's carpenter William Hartwell describes the destruction of the floating laboratory in vivid detail. We worked 3 days and 3 nights to erase every trace of the captain's work. The instruments were chained heavily and thrown into the deepest sea. The books and documents were burned to ashes. The ship was drilled and sunk to the bottom, never to be revived. Another testimony from a woman known only as Maria C., who was one of the few female subjects written in Spanish in 1731, provides horrifying details of the procedure that tested the limits of human endurance and the effects of chemical compounds on physical and mental function. Dr. Hartwell concludes that Thorne's level of human experimentation was decades ahead of that of Europe, although the secretive nature and lack of physical evidence make complete historical verification almost impossible. The fate of the original 42 Carolina residents was partly confirmed by genetic research by the Colonial Historical Society in the 1930s. Death records were falsified, stating that they died in shipwrecks while fleeing, when in fact, they were captured by Thorne. Burial records from many Caribbean islands mention unmarked graves with people bearing unusual surgical marks and dying, while mentioning medical experiments on British ships. Although scattered and lacking direct evidence, these references paint a consistent picture of survivors and victims across the Caribbean, their true experiences obscured by shame and fear. However, the knowledge of Thorne's experiments did not disappear entirely. Some former assistants, weighed down by guilt, but still skilled in the art, opened small clinics in remote locations, offering advanced medical practices without revealing their origins. One example was the Dutch physician who operated on the island of Curaçao from 1720–1754, performing almost miraculous cures. Similar reports emerged from other islands, suggesting that the surviving knowledge was used to help rather than harm. According to the monastery records, these practitioners lived in constant fear, afraid that their advanced skills would attract attention and provoke questions about their mysterious origins. The last confirmed sighting of anyone connected to Thorne's organization occurred in 1756 when a dying man in Port Royal, Jamaica, confessed to a local priest. He identified himself as Thomas Peyton Jr., claiming to be the son of the Carolina shipwright taken by Thorne's forces. His confession, preserved in the parish records, described growing up aboard Thorne's laboratory ship and witnessing the final experiment that had led to the collapse of the organization. He confirmed that 4 of the original Carolina colonists survived, but all had sworn never to reveal their experiences or return to their former lives. By 1760, all references to survivors and practitioners connected to Thorne's experiments vanished entirely. The terrible knowledge gained at such a human cost appeared to have finally died, with its last carriers taking with it both the promise of medical breakthroughs and the memory of the horrors that created it. This story reminds us that even the noblest pursuits can become corrupted when we abandon moral foundations in the service of progress. The 42 colonists who vanished in 1714 became unwilling martyrs to medical advancement, their suffering hidden from history until the monastery documents finally revealed their fate. The knowledge lost with Thorne's organization represents both a terrible loss and a necessary sacrifice. Innovations that might have saved countless lives came at a cost too high for any civilized society to accept. The scattered graves across the Caribbean, falsified death records in Carolina, and hidden testimonies in monastery archives stand as silent witnesses to the consequences of pursuing knowledge without moral restraint. Whether the modern difficulties reported by Caribbean fishermen and sailors are natural phenomena, superstition, or something more inexplicable remains debated. What cannot be debated is the historical impact of Captain Ezekiel Thorne's transformation from healer to monster, and the ultimate price paid by the 42 innocent colonists whose only crime was being selected by a brilliant mind that had forsaken its humanity. What do you think of this account? Could Thorne's medical discoveries ever justify his methods? Or are there boundaries that should never be crossed in the name of scientific advancement? How do we balance the potential for progress with the protection of human rights and dignity? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you think the line should be drawn between knowledge and morality. If you enjoyed this dark chapter of American maritime history and want more stories exploring the complex relationship between scientific ambition and human ethics, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves unraveling the hidden truths of our past. Join us next time as we delve into another forgotten story, pulling back the shadows of American history to reveal the truths that time tried to conceal.